All right. Welcome everyone again. Already botched it up. Dang it. Well, today we are diving into chapter 3 of None Dare Call It Conspiracy by David Allen. Or not David Allen. Sorry, he's not getting the credit this time. It's Gary Allen. And this chapter is ominously titled The Money Manipulators. If you've read the previous chapters or you've come here on the videos, you'll know that the book delves into some pretty serious territory, but chapter 3 certainly takes things to a new level. Here, Allen starts naming names, pulling back the curtain, at least according to his understanding, on some of the most powerful forces allegedly in history. So while it is important to remember that this book, like any other, has a thesis that it's trying to prove, the concepts presented here are worth exploring, certainly, especially in a world where unseen forces often shape the political landscape. I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, so just so you know, I come at it at that sort of, with those sorts of things behind it, my own ideas from that and from my upbringing. We were told by a president of our church, President Benson, that, or he recommended that everyone should read this book back in the, I can't remember if he mentioned it probably in the 70s. I don't think it was in the early 80s at this point, but in a famous clip, you can look it up. It's just President Benson, conspiracy fact, and it'll come up. It's like a 3-minute YouTube video. You can look at that. But independent on that, even though like the Book of Mormon at large speaks of kind of the dangers of this sort of thing, in the Book of Mormon they're called Gadianton robbers, and for that reason we really feel that the Book of Mormon for us is a warning for things happening in our day. And so a lot of the things sort of echo what we find, what we seem to find today, certainly find warned about by many commentators in and out of the church. Certainly President Benson did that, and certainly this author does the same thing, and he has defined communism as a conspiratorial power or conspiratorial, what is it, overreach. I mean, there's a lot of little factors with that, but let's keep going. So this chapter, I wasn't sure even how to tackle it because of all the names that are pulled, and I know that sometimes it can like cause some issues and feathers ruffled when you kind of dip behind the curtain a little bit or make claims. So I want to make it clear that this is the author's ideas. And even though maybe some of the names, like I haven't verified all these, even though these are names that we all recognize and we've heard some of these sorts of things before. Some people are called conspiracy theorists for thinking that. But either way, I think the concepts are still relevant, regardless of the names. But yeah, very, very kind of ominous chapter. So Allen begins by introducing us to the idea of central banking as a critical force in moving the world ever closer to communism. He describes the central banks as fingers on a hand, or one of the fingers on a hand labeled with the terms, maybe the thumb would be international banking, the next foundations, another the anti-religious movement, Fabian socialism, which is kind of in between communism and fascism, kind of the socialism in between that is kind of a sliding towards, ever towards deeper socialism, almost like you are kind of like bleeding a little bit and it just ever is going towards that. And the last finger being communism. So these elements, according to Allen, are interconnected, working together in ways that aren't always obvious to the public, but are deeply influential. One of the of the most startling revelations in this chapter is the role of international bankers in financing governments and even wars. And I think a lot of us think about that, and we've heard all sorts of people talk about this sort of thing. And sometimes they look like tinfoil hat people. Sometimes it's hard to make of exactly all this. But Alan points out that governments, like businesses, need money. But when they spend more than they collect in taxes, they turn to borrowing. And who lends them this money? Which is a good question. Like, where does the collateral come from as well? Primarily vast banking firms known as international banks. So for centuries, these international bankers have found it profitable to finance governments. And it comes with complications, to say the least. Alan explains that just as a business must give its creditor a voice in management when borrowing large sums, a government too must surrender some measure of sovereignty. When it can't pay its debts, what does it do with collateral? Instead of you can't send people in to collect, right? But they can make deals, which sometimes lead to monopolies, and we'll get to that. So this gives the international bankers significant influence over the policies of nations. And sometimes these international bankers, according to the author, according to these people that talk about this, sometimes they control central banks in a number of different countries and can control kind of the ebb and flow of things, both within a country and between countries. And if a leader resists this influence, as some people will say, people like Trump would have done, the bankers have the power to finance the leader's enemy or rival. It's a ruthless game of power and control. So Alan specifically highlights the Rothschild family as key players in this game, particularly in the 1800s. The Rothschilds amassed incredible wealth by financing governments at war with each other, essentially positioning themselves as kingmakers. Again, according to the author and according to people that talk about this, I'm just relaying the info from this book. Their ability to manipulate the balance of power in Europe is well documented, and Alan argues that this influence extended far beyond just European borders. However, Alan is careful to point out that while the Rothschilds were Jewish, the conspiracies he describes is not a Jewish conspiracy. He condemns anti-Semitic interpretations of history, stressing the international banking that international banking has involved various families and institutions, including Anglo-Saxon ones like J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller. The real issue, according to Alan, is the centralization of financial power and its use to manipulate global events. So how does this control work? Alan argues that one of the most effective tools these bankers have is this central bank, or an idea of a central bank. Alan quotes Karl Marx, who identified the centralization of credit as essential for controlling a nation's economy. Lenin later emphasized that establishing a central bank is a major step towards communizing a country. And why would that be? Alan goes on to describe how the central banks of Europe were not owned by their respective governments, but were privately owned monopolies. This allowed a small group of international bankers to exert enormous influence over entire nations. And naturally, these bankers were eager to establish a system similar in the United States. So it's interesting because as I read through this, and it's clear that no book can be totally unbiased, clearly. And even as we are going to facts, and this is how he opens the chapter, like as we go in classes and we read of history, there are just so many things that happen in the world, and we have the grand political stage and the stage of things happening in war and in individual revolutionaries and things like that. And there's just so many of those things that even if everything was on the table for everyone to see, it would still be difficult to parse through all the contributing factors perfectly. And really, it would kind of go towards the bent of whoever is, putting those facts into a history book. So even books like this one would have its own bent, but every book, every history book kind of goes towards proving the thesis of whatever author it is, and that also goes with this one. But Gary Allen, he says that, all these things can be verified within any large library. Of course, I haven't done that, so take what I have with a grain of salt. But he's included many very interesting quotes and things that I'd like to verify at some point. So, going back, the battle for control over America's banking is a key theme in this chapter. From the early days of the Republic, figures like Thomas Jefferson were aware of the dangers of banking establishments. Jefferson even warned that they were more dangerous than standing armies. Despite this, international bankers managed to create a series of financial panics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which paved the way for the establishment of the Federal Reserve. And there was just so much. Like, the reason why I'm kind of glossing over this, like, we would be here doing a 3-hour... I'd be reading everything. So I'll just say, like, go read this book. It's short. It's only 150 pages. I'm just giving you the Cole's notes of what's going on. But I didn't want to read everything, like all the quotes and stuff like I did in chapter 2, and I hope that's okay. Allen tells us about secretive meetings, particularly the one held at Jekyll Island, which quite the name for that, where the framework for the Federal Reserve System was created. This meeting included key figures like Paul Warburg, Nelson Aldrich, and representatives from J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller. The plan was to present the Federal Reserve as a regional reserve system, disguising its true nature as a central bank that would control the entire economy. To maintain the illusion that the Federal Reserve Act was a populist victory, the same insider financiers who crafted it also staged a public opposition to it, to the very thing that they're trying to push forward. This tactic was likened to the Briar Rabbit pleading not to be thrown into the briar patch, a clever ploy to manipulate public perception. Although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated initially, its core elements were repackaged and passed as the Federal Reserve Act on December 22nd, 1913. And again, I want to, I have to mention Ezra's Eagle because it's kind of the thing of the day. We're kind of pushing towards Hoover, which in 1929 to 1933, that's when he's in, and that's kind of when people say that, like, or that's kind of when it is theorized that this communism or things really started to take root. So we're kind of waiting for the hook to sink, which is coming up here. So December 22nd, 1913, during a rushed congressional session just before Christmas. This act, according to Allen, was a pivotal moment where Woodrow Wilson fulfilled his pledge to the insiders who had backed his rise to presidency, and kind of goes into the idea of Woodrow Wilson kind of flirting with them for the decades before, and at least a decade before, and then kind of being their puppet. Even though at one point he would have spoken against this sort of thing, he kind of fell into it hook, line, and sinker. So, while there was genuine opposition to the Federal Reserve Act, it was ultimately overshadowed by the overwhelming power of its advocates. We have Senators Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. and Congressman Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. were among those who foresaw the dangers. Lindbergh warned that the act would create the most gigantic trust on earth, which is frightening. If that's in all these different things, it has to do with controlling that central, controlling the credit. And if you can control that within a whole nation, it's like it's like a nation who owes money to a mafia, right? So he warned about this. It would be the most gigantic trust on earth, legalizing the control of government by money power. Despite these warnings, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, and it has since been hailed as a triumph of democracy over the so-called money trust. But, as Allen argues, nothing could be further from the truth. The Federal Reserve wields enormous power over the U.S. economy. It controls the money supply, sets interest rates, and can influence the entire economic landscape, creating inflation, deflation, recession, boom at its discretion. And so this is where the author certainly kind of argues with the idea of all this like inflation and deflation kind of happening accidentally versus people being behind it, doing these things for their own benefit. Congressman Wright Patman once described the Federal Reserve as an independent, uncontrolled, and uncoordinated government operating with powers that were supposed to be reserved for Congress. This consecration of power, argued Allen, is the crux of the conspiracy described in this book. And when a nation, like at the time that this was written, it was the national debt in the U.S. was something like $455 billion, I think, which is like the good old days, right? Now that it's almost 35 trillion or whatever it is. And again, when a country can't pay for something or can't pay back, governments may be quick to offer monopolies to these bankers, which is ultimately what they're after, and not just have the central banking, but control things in transportation, control oil, control resources, all those sorts of things, monopolies within these areas, so that money has to go through them. And not hard to see how tyranny can happen, or is even likely under those factors, those circumstances. So Professor Carroll Quigley, a respected historian, revealed in his works the plans of international bankers to control the world from behind the scenes. He described how these financial elites aimed to establish a dictatorship of the super rich disguised as workers' democracies. Isn't that funny? Like calling for a grassroots sort of thing, and then it turns out to be the total opposite, which is, people in the top 3%, 1% owning most of everything. And again, like I know that some of these are sort of like whistles for other things, because we know that the left speaks out against this sort of stuff, but then we have like socialists will speak out against this sort of thing, but it seems like the things that they are pushing for just will feed into that very problem. It's crazy time we're in. So J.P. Morgan, one of the most influential figures in American finance, was instrumental in pushing the U.S. into World War I to protect his loans to the British government, which is quite the statement to make. He also financed socialist groups to create a powerful centralized government that could be controlled by international bankers. After Morgan's death, his partners continued to wield significant influence, even financing the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which is the theme of Chapter 4. Despite the enormous power of the Federal Reserve, it has never been subject to an audit, which I never knew that, and that kind of blows my mind. And attempts to subject to an audit have been firmly resisted. This lack of transparency only adds to the suspicion and concern surrounding that. And he spoke about how people who work in the reserve are appointed on 14-year terms or something like that, and we don't even know who they are. And in some ways, or in many ways, that role that role is so important, more important than a lot of the people that we see in Congress and that sort of thing. Like, they're managing the money behind the scenes. So, since the establishment of the Federal Reserve, the national debt has skyrocketed, which is totally the opposite of what was promised. It was supposed to be this hedge against a bust. When Wilson took office, the debt was just $1 billion. And by the time Allen wrote the book in 1971, it had ballooned to $455 billion. So I did write that down. The interest of this debt has become one of the largest items in the federal budget, with billions paid out annually to the international bankers who hold this debt. Meanwhile, the nation's gold is mortgaged in European central banks, and its silver reserves had been sold or depleted, right? One of the selling points of the Federal Reserve was to eliminate the boom and bust cycles that plague the economy. However, Allen argues that the cycles have continued, with the Federal Reserve using periods of inflation and deflation to manipulate the economy for the benefit of the international bankers. And this reminds me of the conspiracy involving Nero, 70 AD, when Rome burned and blamed the Christians and whatnot and caused all this thing. You know, the Christians already had a bad reputation, so when it was burning down, it was easy to blame it on the Christians. Some people would blame it on Nero because it was kind of fishy that after this all happened, he bought up everything everything was burnt, so he could get it for plummeted prices, and some even thought that it was him that kind of was the factor behind the fire starting at the Circus Maximus and spreading all over. It just reminds me of that a little bit. And even after these bank stock market things, and like people are leaving the stock market at times with the Great Depression and whatnot, we see what's happened today. Keep an eye on who benefits from this and purchases these stocks at rock bottom prices. Sometimes people will leave, they'll sell right before, and then they'll repurchase their same stocks for like a 99 at 1% of what the stocks were worth just moments before. What the Federal Reserve, the central bank, or the central idea of controlling the money there, the Federal Reserve was supposed to keep away from that, or be to help to not financially totally crumble. But between 1923 and 1929, remember 1929 is our first sort of marker that we're looking for to start with Hoover. So between 1923 and 1929, for example, the Federal Reserve expanded the money supply by 62%, inflating the stock market to dangerous levels. The stage was set for the stock market crash of 1929, which Allen describes as a carefully engineered event. Evidence presented at the House hearings on the stabilization of the purchasing power of the dollar suggests that the Federal Reserve was working closely with the European central banks, some of the banks that weren't even owned by their own countries but by international bankers, and that a major crash had been planned as early as 1927. Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England and a close confidant of J.P. Morgan, played a significant role in the scheme after a secret visit to Washington in early 1929. The Federal Reserve reversed its easy money policy and began raising the discount rate, setting the stage for the market collapse later that year. And it's kind of freaky when you read of these people that would go and kind of be wined and dined in Europe, learning about all this central bank sort of situation, and then coming back to try to bring that to America. So when the crash came, it was devastating for the general public and most investors, but not for the insiders. They had either exited the market or sold short, making enormous profits as the Dow Jones plummeted. Obviously, that's something that also, like, it makes you think of what happened with the housing market. But those who knew the score, Paul Warburg's warnings on March 9th, 1929, served as a signal to sell. The engineering crash allowed the insiders to buy back stocks at a fraction of their previous value, further consolidating their wealth and power, just compounding it. The Great Depression that followed was no accident. According to Congressman Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, he argued that it was a carefully contrived event designed to create a condition of despair, allowing the international bankers to emerge as the rulers of us all, while the U.S. had not experienced another depression of that magnitude since then. Allen points out that the country has suffered regular recessions since then. Each of these has followed a period in which the Federal Reserve first inflated the money supply and then abruptly tightened it, causing economic turmoil. The members of the Federal Reserve Board, appointed by the president for 14-year terms, wield more influence over the state than most cabinet positions, yet their appointments are often rubber-stamped by the Senate with little debate. So in the end, the ultimate goal of these international bankers, again according to Allen, is to establish a system of global financial control where the hegemony of world finance reigns supreme. This system would be a supranational control mechanism dictating the economic and political fate of nations from behind the scenes. And if, I'm an idiot, right? So as I'm relaying these sorts of things, I haven't verified a lot of them. It makes me feel like a tin hat person sometimes when I speak of those things and when I believe of those a lot of those things that are being said. And we don't want to be foolish either way. We want to use discernment. But again, this is something that President Ezra Taft Benson believed in, and certainly that doesn't mean that everything within the book is exactly correct and detailed. And we've had pushback. We've had pushback on some of the stuff that has been said by President Benson, but I think the ideas that are being set, that there are these other sorts of Gadianton robbers behind the scenes, is telling. And the fact that the Ezra's Eagle is so dialed into beginning at Herbert Hoover. And that's like, it's weird because why wouldn't there be all these feathers? Why wouldn't it have the 45 total feathers up to now? But it has to do with this conspiracy of the one wing and everything's going perfectly. And then when it starts to kind of unravel and people aren't playing ball the way that it was for the first wing, things start to wake up. And it sure feels like things are accelerating right now. And I don't know if the eagle had awoken, that awakes. If that is true, is the executive branch or these powers behind the powers that are connected with these international bankers. But it sure seems like whatever it is that will be destroyed, that is prophesied to be destroyed, is kind of these committees or these individuals in the smoky rooms that we don't really know about at the moment, and we don't know all the details about, but will be kind of more and more to the forefront and will certainly get their reward in the end. But kind of a freaky time, but it's also a faith promoting time, as we have the Book of Mormon. If you're LDS, it's faith promoting to us, and the Bible speaks of those things, and we have things that it's just quite the thing to see all these different factors leaning forward or going towards this. And it sure appears that in some ways, some of the hooks have been set for living in a communistic society, whether we have, kind of independent of what is being, what the laws are right now and what is being pushed. There are some specific factors that seem to be set and are gradually more moving towards that full-on socialism of the West. And we can see lots of the things that are happening. And if you speak out about this sort of stuff, you are a tin hat or a tinfoil hat person. And that's why I'm sort of resistant to echo some of these things either. But you know what? Whatever. Like, it just is what it is. And I think there are some important things to be aware of. So that's what I'm trying to do. And if you have any comments, please leave that below. And happy to speak with you in the comments if you have any, and talk to you on the next one, which will be, we're almost after the next chapter. We'll be exactly halfway.